When leadership in Venezuela abruptly changes hands, global attention immediately snaps to its borders, and more specifically, to what lies beneath them. This map shows the staggering scale of the country's theoretical wealth: 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, a volume that easily dwarfs the underground assets of both the United States and Russia. Policymakers often operate under the assumption that removing an adversarial government will immediately move these reserves from the ground into the global supply chain. Political figures like Donald Trump have actively driven this narrative, anticipating that American capital and oil companies will immediately deploy to rejuvenate the sector. This expectation is positioned as the direct antidote to the previous regime under Nicolás Maduro, whose era of state control presided over the industry's collapse. But geopolitical control is largely irrelevant here. You cannot mandate oil out of the ground if the ironclad laws of petroleum physics and institutional economics remain unsatisfied. To understand why a change in government does not equal an immediate oil boom, we have to look past the political halls and examine the physical reality of Venezuela's output over the last 2 decades. This chart, plotting Venezuelan annual crude oil production from the year 2000 to 2025, establishes the true baseline of the country's collapse. At its peak in the early 2000s, the country was pumping roughly 3.5 million barrels per day. From there, severe mismanagement and the friction of international sanctions drove a catastrophic downward trajectory, bottoming out at just 500,000 barrels per day during the first Trump administration. Reversing an 85% collapse in national output requires solving a compounding crisis of decayed physical infrastructure and prohibitive capital costs. The problem begins underground. Venezuelan oil is largely extra-heavy crude, an extremely dense, highly viscous, tar-like substance. Public discourse often treats crude oil as a single, interchangeable commodity that gets pumped out of the dirt and directly into gas tanks. The reality of refining is far more rigid. This scatter plot maps crude oil quality across 2 axes: sulfur content, or sourness, on the x-axis, and density on the y-axis. The current global standard for highly profitable, easy-to-refine oil, like U.S. shale, sits in the optimal top left quadrant. It is light and it is sweet. Venezuela's primary reserves in the Orinoco Belt sit in the extreme bottom right quadrant. This oil is extra heavy and sour. Because of its density, this sludge cannot even flow through standard pipelines on its own. It has to be aggressively blended with expensive, imported lighter hydrocarbons, known as diluents, just to be moved. These massive reserves are geologically penalized. Their physical viscosity guarantees higher extraction costs and longer processing times, regardless of who occupies the presidential palace. Processing this stubborn material requires an immense, highly specialized industrial footprint. Restoring Venezuela's infrastructure to its historical production peak carries an estimated capital expenditure requirement of $100 billion. This diagram shows where the bulk of that money must go: a massive facility known as an upgrader. The upgrader consumes massive amounts of heat and hydrogen to forcefully strip excess carbon away from the heavy crude, eventually outputting a lighter synthetic oil. Right now, Venezuela has 4 of these installed upgraders. Only 1 is currently operational. Even before the oil reaches an upgrader, the country faces a baseline deficit in extraction hardware. Entire oil fields lack the functional drilling rigs required to tap new wells. A cheap, short-term maintenance program might bring a few 100,000 barrels per day back online within a year and a half. But building new upgraders and the electrical grids to power them takes a decade. This $100 billion requirement translates into a multi-decade physical construction timeline that requires total systemic stability to execute. You cannot build multi-billion-dollar industrial hardware without institutional capital markets. Before any corporation commits to a long-term project, Wall Street applies a strict financial metric, the hurdle rate, or the required cost of capital. This waterfall chart illustrates how that rate is calculated. For a standard, low-risk upstream oil project in a stable jurisdiction, the base cost of capital starts at precisely 10. Private investment becomes irrational, regardless of what politicians in Washington desire. Even if the capital materialized and the oil was pumped, there is a final demand-side constraint in the global refining market. Because it is heavy and sour, Venezuelan crude is geographically trapped. It relies on highly complex, rigid refineries, mostly located along the U.S. Gulf Coast, to be processed at all. And these specific refineries are optimized to produce distinct outputs: diesel, residual marine fuels, and asphalt. But a systemic macroeconomic shift is actively destroying demand for those specific outputs. Heavy transport and freight networks are rapidly electrifying. In a flat global oil market already awash with easy-to-refine, light sweet crude, these expensive, high-carbon, heavy barrels are structurally the first to be cut from the supply chain. This infographic models the true bottleneck. Venezuela's 300 billion barrels flow into the system, but they are immediately choked by three filters: a $100 billion capex requirement, a 25% risk premium, and declining global demand for diesel. Geopolitical interventions can change flags and presidents, but they cannot suspend the laws of geology, finance, and macroeconomics. Until Venezuela can offer a durable rule of law that crushes its risk premium, its 300 billion barrels will remain exactly where they are, stranded underground.